Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's dig into a few of the things that have been added to this bill. And there's a Bloomberg story talking about a section called the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act that would require cosmetic manufacturers to register with the Food and Drug Administration and increase the FDA's oversight of that sector. Kate, what's the story here?
So basically, Kyle, this is a pretty significant expansion of the FDA's authority with very little debate here. These provisions have been in the works for some time. They were debated in the FDA's reauthorization this fall and fell out in the end. And so this is one of those things that's just going to sneak through and nobody's going to pay any attention to because the industry largely supports it. Basically, I think what's going on here is you have sort of a rent-seeking effort by what I would call, quote, clean beauty companies to impose the same cost of business on their competitors by trying to get them to use the same types of products that clean beauty companies use. So basically, this is just rent-seeking. But what it will do, Kyle, it will be really dilute FDA's focus on its core mission. I mean, FDA already has a hard enough time approving drugs quickly. It's lost a lot of public confidence over vaccines. We've seen FDA scrutinized for its role in the baby formula shortage this year. So basically, it will become a new power center within the Food and Drug Administration that will demand more money. And I think it will really detract from what FDA should really be spending its time doing, which is approving new drugs.
There are also some changes to Medicaid rules, Kim, in the bill. And one that we've talked about also is provisions in some of the COVID relief bills that prevent states from removing people from the Medicaid rolls, even if they become ineligible, while the COVID public health emergency remains in effect. And perhaps when Congress passed that, they didn't expect that the Biden administration would continue extending that public health emergency. The last I checked, it expires sometime in early January, but the Biden administration has told states that it will give them 60 days notice before it lifts the public health emergency. And there were some recent headlines that notice deadline had passed. And so there's now an expectation that it will be extended again. And there's an agreement in this omnibus package that states will be allowed to remove ineligible people from Medicaid rolls beginning in April, regardless of whether that public health emergency is extended or not. Kim, what do you make of this? And it seems like there are some other changes to Medicaid in the bill that were bargained for as a result of this one.
Yes. Well, I think that this is worth just pointing again the craziness of this bill. I mean, just to remind everybody, an omnibus is when Congress fails to do its duty and pass its 12 individual spending bills. And so it gets to the end of the year and it crams all its spending into one giant behemoth. And in the past, what we have seen is that Congress will also use that to insert what they call policy writers, little directions here or there that tell agencies how they have to behave or what they're supposed to do. This is unlike anything I've ever seen in that this omnibus has attached to it essentially an entire healthcare agreement full of dozens of provisions that were negotiated between members, things that any one of which would normally be standalone legislation, but instead have all been attached to this bill. I mean, this is legislating via an omnibus, which is a very different scenario than we've seen in the past. Now, one of those, yes, as you said, is probably a good step forward in that we have had this endless public health emergency. And Medicaid rolls absolutely swelled during the initial part of the pandemic. And yet states, even as things return to normal, have not been allowed, because of some legislation and rules, to kick anybody back off. And it's amounted to enormous costs. A lot of people who are continuing to use a program that really aren't eligible and don't qualify for it. So to the extent that this bill looks to potentially give states the ability to begin trimming those rolls, that would be good. Now, nonetheless, also contains this horrible new power grab for cosmetics that Kate was just talking about, a whole bunch of provisions that have to do with Medicare, a whole bunch of ways about how you count who is on government health care or not, and some changes to mandatory cuts that we're beginning to start kicking in soon, but now are going to be delayed to help pay for this. So it's really a mess, and people are going to be spending months trying to figure out everything that got tossed in here.
Well, let me dig down on this accountability question and the omnibus dynamics that Kim was referring to a moment ago. I mean, one of the problems with this mode of doing business in Congress is a lack of accountability. I, for one, would love to see a Senate roll call on the Electoral Count Act and which senators were for it, which senators were against it, how many on each side. And Kate, the problem with this shoving everything into one bill at the end of the year, and I mean, it's a joke, but we're almost getting to the point where Congress negotiates all year and passes one bill days before Christmas, is that there's no accountability. You don't get that roll call vote. And every individual senator can sort of dodge responsibility for passing any of this because they go back home and they say, well, we had to keep the government open, we had to fund defense. And so you can't blame me for the FDA's new oversight over cosmetics. You can't blame me for, anything that's in this 4,200-page bill. And I think that's a real political problem that Congress ought to grapple with, the fact that nobody takes responsibility for this mess.
Yeah, Kyle, I mean, it's corrosive to the public's confidence in Congress. I mean, Congress is always pulling in the single digits of approval ratings. And if you're wondering why, I think this bill is a good display of that. Kim, I think, covered this in great detail. But I mean, if you were talking about some of these policy trades that are significant, for instance, on Medicaid, trading new benefits for the right just to end a public health emergency and adding, for instance, one of the benefits that appears to be in this is more Medicaid coverage for children. But for instance, why do we have the Children's Health Insurance Program if we are expanding child health insurance on Medicaid? These kind of discussions never happen because it just is jammed down everyone's throats right before Christmas. Another thing I'm told that's in this is some major public lands provisions that will be really significant to states out west. Just no discussion about it. And to your point, nobody has to vote on it or stake out a position. And it is a big reason why Americans don't like Congress and don't like government. We have been laying out for many years sensible reforms to the Budget Act and other laws that might help Congress function better, but there just seems to be no appetite for reform because this way of doing business serves so many people. I mean, we're talking about the earmarks that have gotten into this bill and the priorities you can pass at the end of the year that you've all been working on. So that has been just a major barrier to changing any of this.
So where does this omnibus package, Kim, go from here? Is this a done deal, a sure thing set to pass here simply because Congress doesn't want the government to shut down? There's no agreement on any other way to move forward? Or is there still a way that this might get tripped up here in the next few days?
Well, one of the things that I resent is the argument by some Senate Republicans that there are really only two alternatives. We either pass this ugly, horrible beast of a bill, or we're stuck in a continuing resolution in which all government spending is essentially frozen at what it is now until the end of the next fiscal year, which is at the end of September. Of course, there is a third way, which is that you could pass a short-term CR, kick this into next year, and have House Republicans negotiate a better bill in theory. Only that is being disputed by Senate Republicans who claim that Republicans aren't organized enough in the House to actually manage this. Maybe not. Personally, I'd almost rather see a government shutdown than see this horrific thing go through because it's really, really bad. Right now, you have some Senate Republicans who are more fiscally minded and who are pretty disgusted by this process, threatening to potentially object, which could derail the timing on this. Remember, the Senate fundamentally functions by everybody giving unanimous consent to certain actions. If a member or two, say Senator Mike Lee, who is unhappy with this bill, object, you could really delay this out some. And that could potentially derail it only because there is such an appetite at the moment to get this done by Thursday so that everybody can get the heck out of town and go home for Christmas. If they weren't to get it done by the weekend, I'm not quite sure what would happen. Would Chuck Schumer hold people in over Christmas? Would everyone agree to come back after Christmas? Republicans have suggested they're not willing to do that. So I guess that there's a potential that maybe a couple people could throw a stick into this. But I have this feeling, and when you watch this long enough, that this is now a freight train moving, and it could be very difficult to derail it in any way.
Thank you, Kim and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.